Even though most Sanskritists in the present age would agree that Brahmanic tradition has experienced a gradual and continual transformation in forms of religious expression over the course of 4,000 years, some of the earlier translators of Brahmanic texts to the English language regarded prehistoric Vedic practices as a discrete and uniquely inspired religious tradition when compared to those of Hindu communities during India's classical era. To quote one 20th century Sanskritist's opinion on these matters, he says, "Everyone who has carefully studied the Indian interpretations," that would be late interpretations of the Vedas, "is aware that absolutely no continuous tradition extending from the composition of the Vedas to the explanations by classical Indian scholars can be assumed. That, on the contrary, between the genuine poetic remains of Vedic antiquity and their interpretations, a long-continued break in tradition must have intervened." Unquote. Now, most historians in the 21st century would avoid this rather dogmatic point of view, but more than a few scholars still believe that a significant portion of the Hindu pantheon is actually aboriginal in origin. That would mean non-Aryan in origin, and that a considerable portion of classical Hindu deities were introduced at a late stage to the all-encompassing metaphysical Aryan concept of Brahman, the creator of the gods. While even this perspective has also eroded substantially over the years, modern Indologists still pay pretty short shrift to Vedic impacts on many mythic and doctrinal views of Hindu, Buddhist, and Jain traditionalists, all three of those traditions developed concurrently around 500 to 300 BC, which amounts to only a couple of centuries following the Vedic era. And to be sure, all of these traditions adopted the Vedic pantheon and most early Brahmanic doctrines, Vedic doctrines, as their own. In fact, most classical Hindu records of India, including India's famous mythic epics known as the Ramayana and the Mahabharata, as well as countless mythic tales of the Puranas, never do stake claim to any original religious insights. Quite the contrary, classical Hindu texts and mythic records refer constantly, and reverentially, I might add, to the prehistoric Vedas as the ultimate source of Hindu inspiration and spiritual practices. For example, the widely celebrated Bhagavad Gita of classical Hindu tradition, which was likely composed around 2,000 years ago, includes a refrain that is attributed to the human avatar of a Vedic sun god by the name of Visnu. This human incarnation of Vishnu was known as Krishna. And Krishna states emphatically, at a relatively late date, that, and I quote, "I alone am that which is to be known by all the Vedas. And I, Krishna, am the author of the Upanishads and the Vedas knower." The Vedas referring here, of course, to prehistoric lore of the Aryans. Moreover, the primary ritual practice that inspired the early developments of Vedic tradition, this would be the Soma sacrifice, the Soma yajna, is alluded to constantly in classical Hindu texts. This ritual involved the crushing of stems of a psychotropic plant with a mortar and pestle, and extracting the plant's inebriating milky sap. Both the plant and the plant extract were known as Soma, and Krishna was right on board with this rite. To quote again from Krishna in the Bhagavad Gita, "I am the sacrificial stake. I am the Soma. I am the Charu. I am the Homa performance." Now, all of these things that Krishna claims to be, the sacrificial stake, Soma, and so on, are part of the Soma sacrifice. Furthermore, a celebrated king in this same mythic epic states categorically that there is no Brahmin in my dominions who is not possessed of learning, or who is not observant of vows, or who has not drunk Soma. And he adds soon thereafter, the Vedas have settled that Soma is as the king himself to Brahmins. These three, a person, a sacrifice, and Soma, must be of good character. Priests of this same age describe the inebriating effects of Soma in the same manner as we find in the Vedic hymns, noting that, and I quote again from the Mahabharata, when a sage attains to the ambrosia of ambrosia, to a state free from desire and destitute of separate consciousness, a sage becomes Brahma's self, freed from the influence of opposites, content, tranquil, and without pain. This passage describes Brahman bliss, or as the Bhagavad Gita defines the sensation, Brahman nirvana. So the prehistoric practices of ancient Aryan bards never lost their relevance, quite clearly, in classical Hindu ritual and mythology. While it is widely acknowledged that many of the more powerful gods of the prehistoric Vedas, such as Indra, Agni, and Soma, assumed secondary or even subservient roles in classical, later Hindu mythology. This does not mean that these gods ever lost their relevance, because all Vedic gods and goddesses in late Hindu tradition are identified explicitly as manifestations of the Vedic creator spirit known as Brahma. But Brahma is just one of three principal gods of the classical Hindu pantheon that embodies the creative and destructive forces of the natural world. And that would be the one and only creator of the cosmos, whom is known by three titles, three names, Brahma, Visnu, and Rudra Shiva. Now, all three of these gods are of Vedic origin. And each of these gods shares an intimate symbolic relationship with the sacred lotus in Hindu tradition, a plant that we have identified as the Soma plant in our episodes on the Vedas and Soma. This trinity of gods involves itself in deistic roles that express Vedic themes, especially with respect to the age-old cyclic conflicts between the heroic sky gods, the Devas, and the demonic Vedic earth spirits, the Asuras. In these battles between the forces of the earth and sky, the celestial Devas continue to dispossess their earthly counterparts of their elixir of immortality, so as to distribute their hard-earned allotments of Soma among themselves in the heavens to maintain their immortal lives. Thus, an objective view of classical Hindu mythology must acknowledge that the lion's share of all these late narratives are Vedic in origin and in theme. But they do, in fact, introduce some new and innovative ideas and divine actors, without forsaking the central role of the Soma plant. Modern Hindus continue to stand by their prehistoric belief that a single creative spirit both creates and inhabits, as a divine soul or spirit, the bodies of all living beings. So all living creatures can be considered to be incarnations of a singular, universal soul, whom Brahmin priests refer to as, literally, Brahman, or as Atman. But following the Vedic era, Hindu traditionalists envision Brahman/Atman as a singular god with three divine aspects. So a little turn here, a little twist. Each representing one of three life stages that we all, as living beings, experience in a full life. And that would be the stages of birth, one natural process, biological growth, development, reproduction as a second phase of our life, and finally, a third natural process, which is senescence, decrepitude, and death. So these three stages of life, birth, sustenance, and death, represent the triple state. It's called the triguna of Brahman. He has three states, and the three forms, the Trimurti, of all living creatures, a baby, an adult, and an elder, a crone. In Hindu mythology, Brahma is the creator of life, Visnu is the sustainer of life, and Siva is the destroyer of life. Well, that's what Brahman is, God in three persons, but a cosmic person called the Purusha. Each of these gods are also given by tradition 1,000 additional titles, a substantial portion of which are the names of Vedic gods and goddesses. So we are still pretty much on the same pages as the Upanishads and Vedic hymns, which similarly identify the gods as different faces, facets of the same immaterial font of material possibilities, and that would be Brahma. The god Brahma, whose name derives from a masculine rendering of the noun Brahman, is responsible for the creation of life during the inception of a world-eon, that being in Hindu terminology a padma-kalpa, a lotus-cycle. World-eon is described in terms of a seasonal cycle of a lotus blossoming, a padma-kalpa. Brahma is invariably depicted in myths and iconography as a masculine, lotus-seated golden yogi, the image of a cosmic man, golden in color, the so-called Purusha. Brahma sees all and knows all because he has four faces that cast his all-seeing vision across the four quarters of the universe, much as did the plant god Soma in the Vedas. So one of Brahma's alternative titles is Chaturmukha, meaning Chatur, four, Mukha, faces. And the omniscience of Brahma is experienced by priests when they share swigs of the nectar of the gods and become one with Brahma. So, not surprisingly, Brahma himself frequently has a flask of Soma on hand. By all accounts, the experience of Brahma bliss is no different than the Buddhist experience of nirvana. So it is noteworthy that the Buddha in classical Indian mythology shares very close iconographic associations with several Vedic gods, principally with Brahma, the creator, and Indra, the storm god of the Vedas. In fact, Buddha essentially replaced Brahma in popularity in India as the proverbial god of gods in the latter centuries of the first millennium BC, starting around 2,300 years ago. And as can be seen here, the Buddha assumes the same floral seat of enlightenment as Brahma did earlier, that being a lotus throne. But in this scene, Brahma, with his four faces, is observed at the foot of a Buddha's lotus pedestal, and he looks upwardly in deference to the Buddha for having transcended, in fact, materiality as an awakened being, as opposed to Brahma, who has entered materiality. But these two gods and their lotus associations signify the same goal that Buddhists and Brahmins aspire to achieve: enlightenment. And in fact, one of the Buddha's alternative titles is Brahma Bhutto in very early Buddhist texts, which means a Buddha is one become as Brahma. And this is because early schools of Buddhism recognize no distinction between the attainment of Brahman and the realization of nirvana. Or in Hindu tradition, the ever-popular Bhagavad Gita refers to the bliss of Brahma as literally Brahman Nirvana, essentially one word. In post-Vedic Hindu mythology, Brahma appropriates the titles of various prehistoric creator gods, many of whom first appear in the Rig Veda Samhita, such as Prajapati, Hiranyagarbha, Vishvakarman. And as might be expected, Brahma assumes all of the standard mythical and metaphorical attributes of these Vedic gods, as well as their titles. Not unlike Brahman, the transcendental god in the Vedic Upanishads, Brahma in Hindu tradition is said to be self-born, Svayambhu, and self-existent, Atmabhu, both of which states have a direct bearing on his intimate relationship in mythology and iconography with the self-perpetuating growth of lotus plants, whose flowers in Hindu mythology are identified explicitly as Brahma Loka, the material source, the place, and essentially the material identity of the creator. Brahma is a personification, essentially, of a flower. Brahma, from his appearance at the dawn of time, is said to be lotus-born. He is padma-sambhava. He is padma-yoni. And he exists throughout each lotus cycle as a golden sage that sits padmasana, kamalasana, which is to say, lotus-seated. He never descends from his throne. He sits. He is padmasana. Each cosmic time period is marked by the birth of his primordial lotus, with golden Brahma sitting within. And the padma-kalpas end with the disappearance of the plant, which burns itself out and dissipates into Vishnu and Brahma's aquatic abyss. Brahmanic tradition has always described the earth and Brahma Loka, the place of Brahma, in terms of a massive opening lotus flower. And the summit of this so-called Lotus Mountain serves as a home to the gods. Or in related hymns, the blossom is deified as an anthropomorphized goddess known as Bu, or Pirtivi. She typically stands upon or springs from a lotus blossom. So Brahma Loka, as essentially the material world is a lotus, or the earth goddess is a lotus flower. Naturally, these iconic and mythic images also relate historically to the all-seeing, all-knowing golden eye of Vedic Soma, the plant of the gods. This god also is identified conventionally in Hindu iconography as the sacred lotus. And like Brahman of the Vedanta, the Upanishads, the Brahmanas, Brahma fulfills his causal role in Hindu mythology as an unmoved mover of the universe by turning his world wheel of creation, his sun-like lotus flowers. And as we know from our episodes on Vedic symbolism, none of these mythic themes or metaphors were new to Hindu priests, since the same golden wheels and golden eyes pertained originally to Vedic Agni, Surya, Brahma, and Soma. Brahma's name is therefore just one of a long list of titles for the same creative principle of life that Indo-Aryans have always worshipped. The names change, but the flower stays the same. Each member of the Hindu Trinity, whose powers represent three distinctive phases of life, adopted a different animal vehicle to distinguish themselves, the vehicle known as the Vahana. The conventional vehicle of Brahma in classical mythology is a heavenly goose, a cosmic goose, in fact, of Vedic renown known as Hamsa. Hamsa means literally in Sanskrit, goose. Not surprisingly, this divine creature is also a prehistoric zoomorphic incarnation of Soma Pavamana in the Rig Veda. So Brahma, the unborn grandsire of the universe, either mounts the back of a goose or, in the Mahabharata, he harnesses a team of geese to lift his golden lotus chariot into the heavens. It is surely not by coincidence that iconographic renderings of the plant god, Chandra Soma, in Nepal seen here on a goose-driven lotus chariot, is indistinguishable from Brahma's own mythic image in the Hindu epics. These symbolic connections are also observed in an Indian sculpture of Soma Chandra, that meaning Soma as the moon of plenty, from the state of Orissa, which was presumably executed as late as the 13th century. Here the famous Vedic plant god is portrayed as a lotus-throned yogi with a Soma vessel in his hand. And were it not for this god's single face, the image could easily pass for, well, Brahma in classical Hindu iconography, who we see here on a lotus throne with a Soma vessel to his side, but with 4 faces, not one. Consequently, it's almost impossible to distinguish Brahma from Vedic Soma in both mythic and iconographic impressions from India's classical era. Although Brahma is already recognized as the sole creative spirit in verses of the Atharva Veda, this Veda being comprised of hymns that probably date from around 3,000 years ago, this god's prominence as a mythic figure in early classical literature seems to peak around the turn of the 4th century BC. That would be a half a millennium later. But soon thereafter, Brahma's own stature seems to diminish rather abruptly to the advantage of the Vedic sun god known as Visnu, who tends to command center stage in the epics and most of the later Puranas. Since Vishnu's first ascent to Earth involves his creation of a massive lotus stalk from his cosmic navel, which provides the platform on which Brahma is supported, Vishnu has begun his move at this point into the highest echelons of the Hindu pantheon by becoming the actual root source, or the root of nature, the Mula Prakriti of Brahma and his throne. So Vishnu is the source, not the material identity of the throne. That would be Brahma. Once the floral womb has risen into the heavens, Vishnu then casts his cosmic seed into the womb of Brahma, into the womb of the flower, at which point the whole universe is illuminated for the first time. All of these motifs represent variations on prehistoric Vedic themes and concepts. Of course, Pillar of Soma formerly supported the pillar or skambha of Brahma. Now it's Vishnu. And it was Soma that formerly spilt his own seed into the lap of the Punjab's rivers, or into the riverine earth goddess Aditi, in order to sire the Vedic pantheon. Now it's Brahma, whose source is Vishnu, and whose destruction will be manifest by the 3rd member of the Trinity, Siva.